For decades, the Central Intelligence Agency operated behind a wall of secrecy that no outsider could penetrate. But by the early 1970s, that wall had begun to crack. Public trust in American institutions had collapsed in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the Pentagon Papers, and the Watergate scandal. And inside the CIA itself, something even more dangerous was brewing. A dossier so explosive that even high-ranking officials believed its release could destroy the entire agency. The document became known as the Family Jewels. It began as an internal damage control operation. In 1973, amid rising fears of congressional investigations, CIA Director James Schlesinger ordered every office, every division, and every covert branch to compile a record of activities that had the potential to embarrass the agency, or worse, reveal illegal operations conducted on U.S. soil. These were not routine reports or bureaucratic paperwork. They were confessions. Each department was expected to list anything and everything that could be considered a violation of the CIA's charter. What emerged was a 700-page catalog of secret programs, operational abuses, unauthorized surveillance, and covert experiments that stretched across decades of Cold War history. The document was never intended for public release. It was designed solely as a classified internal map of the CIA's most dangerous vulnerabilities, a list of actions that, if exposed, could trigger public backlash, political collapse, or criminal prosecution. Among the pages were reports of domestic spying programs targeting anti-war activists, journalists, and political dissidents. There were accounts of opening private mail without warrants, recording Americans, phone calls, and monitoring civil rights leaders under the guise of national security. One section detailed the agency's relationship with organized crime figures in attempts to assassinate foreign leaders. Another referenced biological experiments and chemical dosing programs that operated in secret medical facilities and prisons. The Family Jewels file did not provide full details. It provided enough to confirm the worst suspicions of what the CIA had been doing behind closed doors. When Schlesinger left the CIA in mid-1973, he warned his successor, William Colby, that the file existed and that its contents were so sensitive they could never be allowed to reach the outside world. Colby was now the custodian of the agency's darkest secrets. For months, the file remained locked away, referenced only by those who needed to understand the scope of the CIA's risk. But the United States was already hurtling toward a political crisis. Watergate was unraveling the presidency. Congressional leaders began demanding accountability from federal institutions that had operated unchecked for years. And when the press uncovered early references to illegal CIA surveillance, journalists began asking questions the agency had hoped no one would ever consider. Behind closed doors, the Family Jewels became the most dangerous document in Washington. Reporters had heard rumors, lawmakers had begun whispering, and activists suspected that the violations they had long alleged were not paranoid fantasies, they were real. Inside the CIA, officials struggled to contain the fallout. Some believed the file should be destroyed before it became a liability. Others argued that destruction would be seen as evidence of guilt if Congress received even a hint of what existed. Every option carried catastrophic risk. The agency had spent decades operating under a culture of secrecy and autonomy, and now its past was threatening to ignite the political landscape. The Family Jewels file sat in a classified vault, gathering dust but never losing its power. The question was not whether someone would eventually discover it, but what would happen when they did. By the end of 1974, the fragile protection around the document finally began to crumble. A series of leaks exposed parts of the CIA's domestic operations, and suspicion intensified. The White House demanded answers. Congress prepared formal investigations, and journalists, sensing vulnerability, began digging with unprecedented determination. The CIA was cornered. The agency could no longer deny that something enormous and potentially illegal lay hidden behind its walls. The pressure to reveal the truth or to bury it forever had begun. Part 2 will cover the public unraveling of the file, the church committee, and the explosive contents revealed for the first time. The first crack in the wall of secrecy formed quietly, almost imperceptibly, inside a country that was still reeling from Watergate Vietnam and a deepening distrust of every institution that claimed authority. The American public didn't know it yet, but the storm that had toppled a president was about to bleed into the intelligence world. And the CIA, an agency accustomed to operating in the shadows, was about to face the most dangerous enemy it had ever encountered: exposure. Inside Langley, Richard Helms had already been forced out, carrying with him a lifetime of secrets and a reputation as the agency's most unflinching protector. His departure had not resolved anything. It had only left behind a vacuum, and that vacuum was now filling with fear. Files that had been buried in locked cabinets, classified beyond the reach of oversight, suddenly felt electrified liabilities waiting for the wrong hands to discover. The family jewels report, assembled reluctantly and under internal pressure, sat like a dormant bomb. It held a decade of covert abuses, collected reluctantly after Watergate, only to be hidden in a secure vault. Its existence was known only to a handful of CIA officials. They believed they could keep it contained. They believed they were safe. They were wrong. The world outside Langley was changing quickly. Investigative journalists, empowered after Watergate, were becoming more aggressive. Congress was waking up after years of deferring to intelligence agencies in the name of national security. And ordinary Americans were beginning to suspect that the institutions built to protect them had been hiding something darker. In this fragile atmosphere, the agency's carefully maintained illusion of control began to erode. The first blow landed in December 1974, when investigative reporter Seymour Hersh published a story that detonated across the political landscape like an explosive charge. His reporting revealed, in stark, undeniable detail, that the CIA had conducted illegal surveillance operations on American citizens. It was a scandal that the agency had feared for years, because it pierced the veil between foreign intelligence and domestic liberties. The Central Intelligence Agency, barred by law from spying inside the United States, had crossed that line repeatedly, deliberately, and with full awareness of its illegality. The article triggered public outrage. Congressional offices were flooded with calls. Newspapers across the country dedicated front pages to the revelations. The American people wanted answers, and for the first time, political leaders were unwilling to shield the agency. Inside the CIA, panic simmered. The family jewels had been created precisely because officials feared a scenario like this. And now that scenario was unfolding in real time. The report sat locked in a safe, but its contents, assassination plots, mind control experiments, wiretapping, surveillance, kidnappings, were no longer theoretical risks. They were potential ammunition for prosecutors, politicians, and the public. There was only one remaining question: how long until someone demanded to see the files? That moment arrived faster than the CIA expected. In January 1975, President Gerald Ford, under growing pressure to respond, created a commission to investigate intelligence abuses. It was the first step towards something the agency had always wanted to avoid: external oversight. Ford hoped that a White House controlled commission would contain the damage, but the walls were already cracking. Congress, sensing weakness, initiated its own investigation. Unlike the White House, Congress had no interest in protecting the CIA from embarrassment. Two major committees were formed, one in the Senate, one in the House, both determined to uncover the full truth. And their combined investigations soon became the most comprehensive inquiry into U.S. intelligence in history. When the committees demanded access to internal CIA records, the agency had no choice but to comply. And for the first time since its founding, the CIA found itself unable to control the narrative. The family jewels were no longer safe. Staffers working for the Church Committee, the Senate's investigation, entered secure rooms in Langley, reviewing files under the watchful eyes of CIA security officers. What they found inside the report was far more disturbing than the public had imagined. It wasn't just domestic spying. It wasn't just overreach. It was an institutional pattern of violating laws, evading oversight, and operating under the assumption that the agency answered to no one. The investigators flipped through pages detailing assassination attempts on foreign leaders, including plots that had involved poison, covert hit teams, and joint operations with criminal organizations. They discovered operations that had violated the rights of American citizens, including journalists and activists who had been monitored, surveilled, or targeted. They found programs that experimented on unwitting individuals with drugs, hypnosis, and psychological torture, remnants of MKULTRA, a project the CIA had spent years trying to erase from existence. Every revelation deepened the sense that the agency had been operating in a world without moral or legal boundaries. And as investigators worked through the files, they realized that they weren't looking at isolated incidents. They were looking at an entire system designed to ensure that no wrongdoing ever reached the outside world. The family jewels exposed that system. They described how the agency used front companies, shell organizations, classified budgets, and layers of plausible deniability. They showed how operatives were trained to avoid leaving written evidence, how internal memoranda were intentionally vague, and how illegal operations were shielded by verbal orders that were never documented. The files revealed a culture where secrecy wasn't just a method, it was a survival strategy. The committees, stunned by the scope of what they discovered, prepared reports that would eventually shock the nation. But even they couldn't reveal everything. Portions of the family jewels were deemed too sensitive for public release. Some material was withheld at the request of the executive branch. Other sections were so heavily redacted that they became nearly incomprehensible. Still, the information that did reach the public was enough to change the way Americans viewed their intelligence agencies forever. The CIA, desperate to limit the damage, worked behind the scenes to frame the abuses as historical mistakes, relics of a different era. But the public, already distrustful after years of scandal, was unconvinced. The family jewels embodied something deeper, a pattern of secrecy and power that had corrupted the agency from within. Inside Langley, the mood grew darker. Officials feared prosecutions. They feared reforms. They feared losing control of covert operations around the world. For the first time, the agency truly believed that its future was at risk. But even as hearings began, even as the public learned about scandals that had been buried for decades, the CIA still kept its most dangerous secrets locked away. Many files were never shown to the committees. Others were quietly relocated. Some were destroyed. And the agency ensured that the most sensitive operations, the ones that could implicate senior officials or reveal ongoing programs, remained hidden. What the public saw was only the surface. The real family jewels, the core of the agency's darkest operations, stayed buried. As the investigations progressed through 1975, the media chronicled each revelation with growing intensity. Americans learned about CIA mail opening programs, illegal break-ins, secret prisons, unauthorized surveillance against domestic dissidents, and covert attempts to influence foreign elections. They learned about plots that targeted individuals who had been labeled threats without any legal justification. They learned about an intelligence apparatus that had grown far beyond its intended limits. But what made the family jewels uniquely disturbing wasn't simply the list of abuses. It was the realization that the CIA had knowingly compiled them into a single file, acknowledging, internally, that these actions were indefensible. The report represented a kind of confession, created not out of conscience but out of fear. For the first time in its history, the CIA had been forced to look at itself in the mirror, and what it saw was an institution built on shadows. By late 1975, the agency's leadership understood that they were no longer fighting journalists or congressional staffers. They were fighting time. Once the existence of the family jewels became widely known, public pressure would only intensify. And so the CIA adopted a strategy of controlled disclosure, releasing enough information to appear cooperative, while hiding enough to protect its core operations. This strategy worked partially. The committees released their findings, reforms were enacted, and public outrage eventually subsided. But the agency survived. It adapted. It rebuilt its political alliances. And as the years passed, the family jewels receded into the background of public memory. But the files never disappeared. They remained sealed, locked behind layers of classification, their contents unknown to everyone except a small group of officials. And for decades, the American public remained unaware of just how much had been hidden from them. It would take more than 30 years, and relentless pressure from historians, journalists, and freedom of information advocates, before the family jewels would finally be declassified. And when they were, the world realized that the story still wasn't over. There were still redactions, still missing pages, still unanswered questions, and still the haunting suspicion that the versions released to the public were incomplete, carefully curated to conceal the operations that truly define the agency's shadow history. The CIA may have been forced to reveal its past, but it had not surrendered its secrets. It never would. The family jewels were never meant to survive the 1970s. Inside the CIA, senior officials understood that the greatest danger posed by the report wasn't what it exposed, but that it existed at all. A paper trail could outlive its authors. It could be subpoenaed, leaked, or rediscovered by someone who didn't understand the unofficial rules of secrecy that governed Langley. These were the fears that guided the agency through the late 1970s and the decades that followed. Langley worked quietly to bury the report deeper into its classified vaults, ensuring it remained locked away where public scrutiny could never reach. Oversight committees grew distracted. The political climate shifted. The nation moved on, and the family jewels slid back into the shadows. But the document itself remained radioactive, a silent witness to an era that the agency preferred to erase from memory. And in the early 1980s, under new leadership, the CIA refocused its mission. Covert operations expanded across Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa. New technologies brought new capabilities, and the agency's influence grew once again, this time under a strict policy of compartmentalization, designed to prevent another catastrophe like the family jewels. Everything was controlled, everything was need to know, everything was deniable. The family jewels were considered a relic, an artifact of a rogue period in American intelligence history. But not everyone forgot. Journalists, historians, and public transparency advocates understood that buried documents rarely stayed buried forever. And many suspected that the family jewels contained the kind of explosive details that the CIA would never willingly release. For decades, requests under the Freedom of Information Act were filed repeatedly. Each one met with the same answer. The documents were too sensitive. Disclosures would harm national security. The past, they insisted, was still dangerous. That insistence only fueled more suspicion. By the 1990s, as other declassified files revealed deeper layers of Cold War misconduct, interest in the family jewels surged again. The CIA continued to resist, arguing that certain operations described in the report were still relevant. Even though some of the events had occurred half a century earlier, the agency insisted that details remained classified for the protection of ongoing activities, foreign sources, and internal assets. In truth, protecting sources and methods was only part of the story. What the agency truly feared was precedent. If they released the family jewels without a fight, it would invite further demands. And if the public saw the full scope of past misconduct laid out in the agency's own words, it could reignite debates the CIA hoped were settled long ago. For decades, this stalemate persisted, until a quiet shift began beneath the surface. A new generation of transparency advocates emerged, armed with better legal tools, deeper archives, and a growing understanding of how intelligence agencies managed secrets. They tracked down staffers from the 1975 investigations. They filed strategic FOIA appeals. They compiled evidence from related files. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the outline of a report they had never seen. The pressure mounted. The CIA's wall of resistance thinned. Then, in 2007, more than 30 years after the family jewels had been created, the agency finally broke. It announced that it would declassify and release the files, but only under carefully controlled conditions. What followed was one of the most anticipated disclosures in intelligence history. When the documents were published, researchers around the world rushed to access them. But the files that appeared on the CIA's website were not pristine. They were heavily redacted. Sentences disappeared behind thick black ink. Pages were missing entirely. Some sections were so obscured that they became meaningless. Even so, what remained was enough to stun the public. The release confirmed that the CIA had engaged in domestic surveillance of journalists, activists, and political dissidents. It detailed illegal detentions, warrantless break-ins, unauthorized mail opening programs, and attempts to influence American media. It exposed multiple plots to assassinate foreign leaders, including efforts that had been denied for decades. The files outlined illegal medical experiments connected to MKULTRA, operations that used unwitting civilians as test subjects in drug trials, psychological conditioning, and sensory deprivation. They revealed infiltration of domestic organizations and covert influence campaigns inside the United States. They exposed operations that violated treaties, international law, and fundamental human rights, all concealed behind layers of secrecy. The world recognized immediately that this was not simply a list of abuses. It was a portrait of an intelligence culture unrestrained by oversight, operating under the assumption that ends justified means, and that the agency itself existed beyond the reach of accountability. Historians scrutinized the files line by line. Patterns emerged. The family jewels were not random incidents. They were symptoms of a system built to avoid regulation. Illegal operations were not exceptions. They were part of a broader intelligence philosophy shaped by the anxieties of the Cold War and the agency's own internal mythology. The public, shocked by the details, demanded answers once again. But the CIA deflected. Officials insisted that the report documented a bygone era. They argued that reforms enacted after the Church Committee had transformed the agency. They maintained that the CIA of 2007 bore little resemblance to the CIA of the 1950s and 1960s. Yet even as they said this, the redactions in the family jewels told a different story. Entire blocks of text were removed, names were blanked out, operational details were withheld. The agency claimed privacy concerns, national security, and protection of living assets. But the deeper truth was visible to anyone who studied declassified intelligence history. Some of what remained hidden was not historical at all. Some of it was contemporary. Researchers noticed references to operations that had no known public counterpart. They identified patterns suggesting that certain covert programs had either continued far longer than acknowledged, or had evolved into new structures protected by updated legal frameworks. Others uncovered connections between the family jewels and modern intelligence scandals that emerged after 9/11. The more scholars examined the files, the clearer the pattern became. The family jewels were not simply a window into the past. They were a map of how American intelligence culture had been shaped, and in some ways distorted, by the belief that absolute secrecy was both necessary and justified. The 2007 release triggered renewed calls for transparency. Civil liberties groups demanded the full, unredacted files. Historians argued that the public had a right to know what had been done in its name. Families of victims from CIA overseas operations sought answers. But the agency's response was predictable: silence, delay, and denial. More than a decade passed, and further requests were rejected. The CIA insisted that the information still posed a threat to national security. They argued that declassification would compromise foreign partnerships. They warned that revealing the full truth would harm intelligence capabilities. In reality, the risk was political, not operational. The unredacted family jewels contain names, decisions, and internal policies that would expose the responsibility of powerful figures who never faced consequences. They contain details of operations that violated U.S. law, international law, and ethical standards. They contain truths that would challenge the official narrative of the CIA's role in American history. And so the agency maintains its silence. Even today, more than 50 years after the report was created, the family jewels remain partially hidden. The public version is only a skeleton. The full document, the true version, without redactions, is still locked away, protected by a classification system designed to outlast generations. Researchers suspect that some portions were destroyed long ago. Others may still exist in secure archives, buried so deeply that only a handful of individuals know where they are stored. A few believe that the most incriminating sections were never included in the official report at all, but instead remained in separate compartmentalized files, protected by unwritten rules of secrecy. Whatever the case, the family jewels endure as a reminder of the most dangerous truth about intelligence institutions. Secrecy, left unchecked, becomes its own form of power. And the agency that holds those secrets, whether past or present, wields a power that no election, investigation, or oversight committee has ever fully restrained. The CIA survived the family jewels. It survived the investigations, the scandals, the exposure, and the public outrage. But the legacy of the report continues. It is a shadow that follows the agency across decades, raising the same unanswered questions that haunt every democracy. How much should the public know? How much should the government hide? And what happens when an institution holds more secrets than a nation can control? The family jewels did not answer these questions. They forced the world to confront them. And the full truth, the unredacted story, remains locked away, waiting for the day when history finally breaks the last barrier of secrecy.